I'm turning it on now. So this session will be recorded and we will send you the link like we did the first time. We would like to encourage you to take those handouts that we mailed, this was recommended by our pilot group, and highlight those things, write on those things. I know it's really hard to sit here and for an hour and go through the whole thing and be sitting there in your chair. So I find when I do a webinar, the more active I can be in terms of the information. So you want to mark up those papers and just pace yourself with us. I know it's hard. You want to read ahead. That tends to be me, type A personality, but try to stick with us, and I think this will go well. Okay, so we're going to start right away with our goals, unless you had something else to say, Lorna?
No, we're good.
Okay, so we wanted to let you know that the reason that we put together this whole workshop is that we want you to be wise consumers. As parents and teachers, you're going to have to read tests that were given to your students or your children. And we want you to know, did you really get a good assessment here? Did this person who was doing an assessment of dyslexia do a good job? So that's important. We want you to know basically how to interpret these reports, how to understand them. And we want you to know that dyslexia is a very complex thing. There's not one test. And I think that there are people who thought, oh, this is great. We're going to find out how to figure out what it is. No, this is a very complex thing. There's not one test. And I think anytime I talk about dyslexia with people, I still encounter people, even when I taught a graduate class in reading, I still encounter people who think dyslexia is seeing words and letters backwards. And that's just kind of an urban myth. So we wanted to really get rid of that in your heads. And this is the first step in understanding the process. We don't expect anybody to be a diagnostician when they come out of here, but we really want you to kind of get a big picture on what it's all about. So those are our goals. And if you have any other goals for yourself or anything and you want to type those in, that's fine. I'm opening up that.
Andy, I'd like to interject a question right here.
Sure.
I'm wondering if there are any people present who actually currently administer tests, if you could let us know that.
Great question. Great question. Yes, please type that in if you're currently administering tests to determine a diagnosis of dyslexia. Okay, well, let's see, any suggestions or strategies who struggle with copying from one thing to another? Yes. You know, at some point, we will do a workshop on how to work with students, you know, with disabilities and with reading problems. And this one, of course, is just the first one being how do I know, and the second one, how do they arrive at a diagnosis. But yes, we do have some suggestions for children who have problems with orthography. That can be a challenge. So I'm going to hold on that right now, and if we have time, we can come back to it. And I know as teachers, you're all anxious to know, what are we going to do about these kids with the problems? But we got to give you what we advertised here first. Lorna, did you have anything quickly you want to put in there?
No, maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, let's hold on it for now. Okay, so when you do an evaluation of a child with a reading disability, you're going to do, and you can mark this on your sheet there, these first two things are the kinds of things that you would do when you assess any kind of a issue, problem, disability. You always start with a history because you want to know who is referring this person, why are they referring them, when did this start? And that's very important, because if this is something that just started and the child is in the 8th grade and they never had a problem before, that may tell you that something is happening in the environment that's changing the behavior. The next thing that would happen in any evaluation, not just for reading, is psychological and cognitive testing. That's important, again, because you want to put this in a context. And this is where you're doing testing, you know, we used to call it intelligence testing. I think we're kind of shying away from using that, but these cognitive tests, such as the WISC, which is the Wechsler Individual Intelligence Test, you want to look at this and find out what is this person's general level of functioning so you can put everything else in a context. And after you do those two basic kinds of testings, then there are these 8 constructs, which we're going to talk about this evening, which are specific to looking at a reading disability. So if you're looking at a set of tests, you want to make sure that they did these first 2, which you do for anything, but then you want to make sure that they looked at these 8 constructs, because that's how you come at the diagnosis. And I want to just give a little anecdote here, and that is when I first came to my current job in 2002, I went down to Miami to look at a young man in probably about the 7th grade, and the school had concluded that this boy was just really low functioning because he was reading at a very, very low level. And I remember that I started with the history and with these psychological and cognitive tests, and it was amazing to me because as I began to look at his nonverbal reasoning, this boy just kept going higher and higher, and it was literally exciting for me because he was looking at very complex drawings and patterns, and he was able to put these together in a way far beyond that I personally could do. And I remember saying, that's right, that's right, that's right. It was like the hair was standing up on the back of my neck because this kid was brilliant, and it did end up to be a very severe reading problem. So you have to do these generic kinds of tests, and then you have to do these 8 constructs. So these are the 8 constructs that we're going to be talking about with you this evening. Okay, Lorna, before we get into the 8 constructs, will you talk a little bit about the different kinds of testing here?
Sure. I don't want to get too technical this evening, but there are a couple of principles that I'd really like to touch on that are fundamental to understanding and interpreting test scores. So let's start with the 2 basic kinds of tests that we use. One is called a standardized test, and the other a non-standardized test. A standardized test is also referred to as a norm reference test. It's the same thing. A non-standardized test is also referred to as a criterion reference or an informal test. Now, the non-standardized test might be a test of a student's mastery of a topic. For example, if the teacher does a teacher-made spelling test, she's trying to find out if the students have learned the spelling words for the week. And that score indicates what percentage of the words they got correct. So, for example, a child got 9 out of 10 correct. He got a 90 percentile on the test. A standardized test is different. A standardized test also tests the mastery of a particular area, but it's very different test in the way it's developed, in the way it's administered, and in the way it's scored. A standardized test is meant to compare the student's performance with the performance of other kids at the same age or at the same grade, depending upon which criteria you want to compare with. Now, this is done through a series of very complicated sampling and statistical analyses, so that the score indicates how the student's performance compares with the performance of other kids at the same age or grade. Standardized tests have to be administered in a very strict, standardized manner because you have to maintain the consistency of administration to assure that everybody was administered the identical test. The directions have to be the same. There is no prompting. Things have to be quite standardized in the administration. That's not true in an informal test. You can go outside the boundaries. You can explore. We can do what we call testing the limits in an informal test. It's important to understand the statistical properties and the sampling design so that you know the reliability and validity of standardized tests so that you can make good decisions about which test to use. I promise you, not all tests are created equal. So you really do need to have some kind of an understanding of that so you know which of the tests you want to be selecting. Sandy, can you go on to the next one, please?
Yes, and we have a question here. Would it be the same for a student in kindergarten? Well, yeah, I mean, a student in kindergarten, you could give a norm referenced or a criterion reference test. You certainly could.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In kindergarten, though, I tend to use more informal tests, and we'll be talking about this more as we go along, so I won't go into it too much here. But I think it's always important to have some standardized tests that are part of the report, even for the younger children, because you want to show a baseline with a standardized score, because you want that standardized baseline in order to monitor progress. And so let's talk about these scores.
Yeah, yeah. And we will be talking about some of the specific tests you can use.
Yeah, we will. A standard score is a score that is derived from, as you would guess, a standardized test. In a standardized test, the total number of correct answers is called the raw score. We take the raw score and we transform it into a standard score through a series of statistical calculations. Now, this standard score is used to compare a student's performance with the performance of other students across the country at the same age or grade level. A percentile rank tells us the percentage of students who score at or below. Let me repeat that. Who score at or below the student standard score. So let me give you an example. If a student gets a standard score of 85, that's at the 16th percentile. That means that 16% of students in his grade, age or grade, whichever you prefer, across the country earned a standard score of 85 or less. 84% of the students scored higher than he did. It's easier to understand percentile ranks than it is to understand standard scores. So I usually advise people to focus on the percentile rank. Make sure that the reports that you're reading are giving you percentile ranks, and if they don't, ask for them.
Yeah, that was something that really confused me when I first started getting into this, because I didn't understand that a standard score is just a number and you have to look in a chart in a book in order to translate it into a percentile rank or a grade equivalent or an age equivalent. So the standard score made no sense to me because I was trying to figure it out on its own. The only way you can figure it out is if you have a book and you look in the chart. And the percentile rank, I found, confuses people because they're thinking, okay, a 50% is an F, so a 50% is a low score. No, it means the person is right there in the middle when you're comparing them to others. So both of those two could be confusing.
The other thing that I would caution people about is the use of age equivalent and grade equivalent scores. They're not nearly as precise as percentile ranks. Percentile ranks give you a good reading, and they're fairly easy to understand. Age and grade equivalent scores are far less precise because they're a broader range, and so they're not as accurate.
Okay. So this, when you're looking at test results, look at those percentile ranks. Okay, so now that we gave you some background on testing, we're going to look at the 8 constructs and how they are assessed. So if you want to know if somebody has a reading disability, here's the first one of the 8 constructs that has to be assessed.
Decoding problems.
Mm-hmm.
Decoding problems are the most common reason that most children have difficulty with reading. Most kids who are struggling with reading are kids with decoding problems. Some children have problems with comprehension, of course, but that's far less common. And it also requires a different form of remediation. So you really do need to get at the bottom of a child's reading problem. Decoding is the strongest predictor of reading comprehension. And you can understand why, because if kids aren't decoding accurately, then of course they're going to have trouble with comprehension. So it's important to evaluate decoding in several ways because we want to compare the results of each of these forms of evaluation to get insight into why they're having trouble. Annie, can you go on to the next one, please?
Sure.
All right, these are the 3 standard ways that we need to evaluate decoding. The first one is we want to ask a child to read a list of words. These are real words They begin from the easiest and they go through to increasingly more difficult. Word list reading is the single best predictor of decoding. So if you have to give only one test, which you don't want to do, but if you have to give only one test, this would be the one to give, a good test of word list reading. What word list reading does is it removes the context so that kids who, especially kids who have good verbal reasoning abilities, a lot of them are going to be using context to guess at words. This removes that possibility. So you're just looking at their ability to decode words. The next thing we do is we ask kids to read a list of nonsense words. This eliminates the possibility of their having memorized words, because a lot of bright children will also do that. So when we ask them to read nonsense words, we're asking them just to use their decoding skills to sound out words that are not real words, but that follow basic phonetic patterns from our language. And then we ask them to read words in context. We start with easy, short passages, and we move up to longer and more linguistically complex passages. And here you can use both standardized tests, and the most frequently used one, of course, is the gray oral. And then you can use curriculum-based readings. And I think last time we talked quite a bit about the use of curriculum-based readings and how to use the social studies textbook, how to calculate words correct per minute. So I'm not going to go into that again, but this can be a very valuable part of the evaluation of decoding. Okay, Sandy?
Okay.
When we evaluate decoding, scores are important. And it's important to be able to understand scores and to analyze them, but it's very important to really analyze the student's performance and get beyond the scores. So one of the first things we want to do is to look at the strategies that kids have used for word identification. Are they sounding out? Are they guessing based on context? Are they guessing based on first letter and general word configuration? I see that a lot. Then we want to look at their speed of response. That really becomes quite salient when you're asking them to read word lists. Are they struggling over each word? Are there long pauses? Are they reading fast and automatically? Is there a difference in their reading of phonetically regular words versus phonetically irregular words? Are there specific phonetic elements that you can see that they're having trouble with? When I test a child, I always write down everything they say. You get to the point where you can do that very quickly, so that I afterwards analyze what all of their errors were like. And frequently I'll see a child, for example, who might be having trouble with words of more than 2 syllables, or a child who is constantly getting the vowel teams mixed up, or someone who has trouble with word endings. You want to analyze all of that, because that really informs where you're going to start and what you're going to recommend for remediation. But most importantly, you have to compare a child's performance when reading words in context and when reading words not in context, because there's very often a very big discrepancy. Some kids do much better in context, and you really see their decoding struggles when you remove the context. For other kids, it's the opposite. For some children, they do much better when they're reading word lists because the linguistic complexity or the orthography confuses them when they're reading passages. So you want to have that analysis as part of a report. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, we have a question here. What was the most common decoding test that you mentioned?
Well, I don't know that I mentioned a decoding test, but there are a number. The Woodcock Reading Mastery is a good decoding test. They have in there a subtest that looks at real words and a subtest for nonsense words, and then a subtest for short passages. And then from there, I would go to the gray oral, which will also give you longer passages, and you can get several scores on the gray oral. You can get a decoding score, a fluency score, and a comprehension score.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so the Woodcock-Johnson, the letter word identification subtest is the one that is the list of words. Okay, so that's the first construct that needs to be looked at if you're trying to figure out if someone has a reading disability. The next one, of course, is reading comprehension, the ability to derive meaning from text. I mean, that's why we read. And in order to understand what you read, first of all, you have to read it. I see we have a comment about the dibbles. Dibbles is used often to measure the fluency because that has to do with speed. And we will talk a little bit about that when we get into fluency. And I love your comment on the linguistic complexity of text and context, slowing down so many readers. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So with the reading comprehension, the decoding ability has to be there. And a lot of times I think we just assume, oh, this is a comprehension problem. And we do have to look at, is the decoding holding them up? And then the linguistic comprehension as the passage gets more and more complex, and they're having to look at sentences and language that is not real obvious and simple. What happens? Are they able to really understand it? So that's kind of what we're looking at. So when we evaluate reading comprehension, we're starting with vocabulary, and you're going to see that this goes from simple to complex. So we're starting at the word level. Do they understand the basic words that are going to be in passages? Then we take a look at some short passages. And again, this can be done with the Woodcock-Johnson, with the fill-in-the-blanks passages. Then the extended passages, which can be done with the gray oral. You have to be a little careful there because they can get inflated scores since it is multiple choice and some of the questions are a little on the easy side. If a child does poorly on the gray oral, that's really telling you something. And then the oral and silent reading. And I'm going to open up your mics and ask you, this is actually a debate in the field. Why do you think it might be important to take a look at oral reading when you're looking at comprehension? If kids are going to be reading silently and, then, sorry, I'm trying to open up your mics here. Let's see, do I have them open? I guess I'm trying to open them up, but you may have to open your own. But if you're trying to evaluate the comprehension of somebody who's reading silently, why would you want to have them read orally in order to evaluate that? Anybody like to answer?
Kids need to hear it.
Okay. Yeah, so they need to hear themselves reading? Sure. Yeah. Anybody else? What about you as an evaluator if you hear them reading?
I can tell you that as an evaluator, I like to hear children reading passages orally. It's the only way I can assess how they're using context or whether they're using context to guess at words. Because decoding is such a strong predictor of reading comprehension, I really need to assess how they're using it when they read passages.
Yeah. So it's giving you those clues. Yes, we have sometimes the formation of words orally can impede the comprehension because they're trying to sound things out correctly. Right. If they're putting all the effort, you have just so much short-term memory. So if they're using it all up and trying to figure out how to say the word, there's nothing left to comprehend it. Yes, if they're pronouncing it incorrectly, maybe they're misunderstanding what they're reading, all of this. Yes, and somebody said when they were a child, they could read perfectly, but they didn't understand. So then that's another thing. If they're reading smoothly and they don't understand it, that's telling you something else about perhaps the linguistic complexity is giving them the problem. So you want to listen to them read. Okay, so determinants of reading comprehension. With beginning readers, that decoding ability is really a big piece of it for most of the problems. And then as they move into those higher grades, their cognitive ability, that basic, what we want to say, intelligence level does come into play, and their linguistic ability how they're able to understand language and how it's put together. But if a child has decoding problems, their reading comprehension is going to remain compromised even as they go into those older grades, because if you can't read it, if you're reading the wrong words, it's tough to fully understand it, which makes sense. Okay, Lorna, so we're going to have a performance analysis now of reading comprehension, and there's actually 12 different things that go into just reading comprehension, and this is just one of our 8 constructs. So take us through that.
Sure. So when you see a child who's having difficulty with reading, it's your job as an evaluator, or it's the job of the evaluator if you're the consumer of the report, to try and figure out why. There are a lot of things that can cause problems with reading comprehension. And the most common one that I've already mentioned, of course, is decoding. You really want to assess decoding first before you assess reading comprehension, and you want to see if that's part of the issue. The other has to do with vocabulary. Does the child have a mature enough vocabulary for the level at which he's expected to read? And this kind of becomes a vicious cycle, because as we all grow, we develop our vocabulary through reading. So if a child is a struggling reader, they're not reading as much. Therefore, they're not developing their vocabulary the way their peers are developing vocabulary, and that whole thing becomes a vicious cycle. Is syntactic knowledge an issue? As passages increase in length, as they get more complex linguistically, are the kids having trouble? And I see this a lot. Children with language disorders have trouble with embedded clauses. They become confused with pronouns. As sentences become more complex, they really become quite confused. Do children have more difficulty as passages increase in length? Does that become an issue for them? Is attention causing an issue for them? Now be careful about attention, as I mentioned last time, because if children are having difficulty with just reading and you think that it's an attentional issue related to reading, then that's not attention. Attention affects all learning, not just reading. And then is there a difference in the way you're measuring it? For example, if you're giving a test like on the Woodcock, which we have mentioned before, their passage comprehension, it's not really passages. Those are sentences. There are 1 or 2 sentences in those passages. Is there a difference in their comprehension for shorter pieces of prose as opposed to longer pieces that are longer passages? Sandy, can you flip over, please?
Yes, I'm trying to. Let's see. Here we go.
There is an issue of floor effects for the lower levels, and this was kind of briefly alluded to previously when someone was asking about the issue of evaluating kids in kindergarten. The issue of floor effects for the lower grades refers to kindergarten, first, and sometimes second grade. For a lot of tests, there are too many false negatives. Too many false negatives. In other words, we're not picking up enough of the issues for struggling readers. The reason for that is that there are not enough items at the lower levels of many of the reading tests. So you need to have a very skilled diagnostician who understands the issues and who's also looking at other predictors like phonological awareness and rapid naming, because those will be really important for the lower grades. Does the type of text make a difference? For example, children often have an easier time with fiction than with nonfiction. That's one of the reasons that I really recommend pulling in an informal evaluation using a social studies text. Does the reading format make a difference? In other words, are you seeing a difference in outcome between silent and oral reading? What about response format? This is very important because there's often a difference here. If you're asking them to respond orally, in written form, multiple choice will frequently yield a more inflated score. Single word, open-ended, retell is the most difficult. Are they allowed to look back? That all makes a difference in the scores you're going to get. Do they have difficulty with particular kinds of questions, like the main idea, sequencing events, cause and effect? You want to analyze those questions and see if there's a pattern there. The types of questions, literal, inferential, factual questions, is that where they're having the most difficulty?
Okay. So we've talked about two of our constructs, decoding, reading comprehension. Now we're going on to reading fluency. And I think this is where the DIBBLES comes in. I know some of you have mentioned that you're using the DIBBLES, which is dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. And that's one way to have children read words that are timed. And so we're looking at their ability to read words accurately and automatically with the timed passage reading. You know, the funny thing about this is that when you test children using timed passages a lot, they get to the point that they're used to being timed. And so you may have to remind them if you're doing another type of a test, oh, this isn't a timed test, because they try to read as fast as they can and then maybe they won't even comprehend it. The point of a reading fluency test is just that, to see how quickly they can read. So that's something like DIBBLES you can use, which would be a standardized test. And then you can do a curriculum-based evaluation and calculate the words correct per minute. We did show you that chart last time. And Lorna, did you get a chance to put that under the resource section of the website yet?
I'm not sure if that's up. I'll check.
Okay, but you will find that chart for you in our resources on smartkidcan'tread.com. Okay, so if you are trying to do a performance analysis of reading fluency, what goes into all of analyzing these kinds of tests, Lorna?
Okay, well, again, decoding is the main reason that most kids have difficulty with reading fluency. They're having trouble reading words fluently and automatically. Attention is another issue. A child is going to have some difficulty with reading fluency. Comprehension is an issue. If, for example, kids are having trouble understanding, following what it is that they're reading, that's going to slow them down because they'll start to get confused. They won't know what's going on. That will definitely slow children down. And then, of course, there's the issue of processing speed. Some children are slow in processing all information, not just in reading. But if a child has slow processing speed, then they're certainly going to have difficulty with reading fluency. I can tell you that it's very rare that you'll find a child who has fluency issues that aren't related to one of these four categories, because fluency is related to the occipital lobe, and that there are seldom fluency issues that are seen in isolation unless there's been damage to the occipital lobe through a stroke or some kind of brain damage. I know here in Boston, there is a study that's going on between Mass General and MIT, and they're studying trauma to the occipital lobe, and I worked at one point with an attorney who had a stroke. It was a very, very isolated stroke, and it was only to his left occipital lobe. And you can imagine as an attorney that he was probably a very good reader. After his stroke, he still had reading ability. He was still able to decode without any problem, but his fluency was so slow. When I administered, I think I administered maybe passage 3 on the Gray oral reading test, and that's maybe at a second grade level. I think it took him 4 or 5 minutes to read that one passage.
Wow.
He should have read it in a minute. So that kind of brain damage is probably not something that you're very likely to see in the regular classroom.
Okay. This, before we go on to another one of our 8 constructs, this is important that you understand this next issue when you're looking at scores. Do you understand, how many of you know what a composite or a cluster score is? Anybody know about composite and cluster scores? Okay, good. We have a question mark, so that means we're hitting it on the mark. Lorna, go ahead and explain it.
I agree with Sandy. This is an important issue to be an informed consumer of reports. A composite or a cluster score isn't a test. It's a combination of 2 or more scores. The scores of 2 or more tests, I'm sorry. Let me give you an example here. And again, I took this from the Woodcock-Johnson. And the reason I'm referring to the Woodcock-Johnson so much isn't because I think it's the end-all and be-all in tests, but I know that it's the most frequently used test in schools. And so I assume that many of you may be familiar with it. Broad reading is a composite score on the Woodcock-Johnson. Now, that's not an actual test in and of itself. It is a score that's composed of the scores from these three subtests that are below: letter-word identification, sentence reading fluency, and passage comprehension. So let's take a look at what happened to this particular child. They got a standard score of 70 at the second percentile for letter-word identification. That's a test of wordless reading. Second percentile is very low. That means that 98% of the kids scored higher than this child did. Reading fluency, they were below the first percentile. That's even lower. Passage comprehension was at the 84th percentile. This child's doing very well. Now, what's going to happen is these scores get combined, and they're combined not just by averaging, but some of them are weighted scores, so that passage comprehension will have more of a weight than, for example, some of the other scores in this cluster. So this child will get a broad reading score of 6th percentile. Now, I know that in many schools in Massachusetts, if this child went to a standard score of 85, which would put him closer to the 15th percentile, he wouldn't qualify for services. And yet broad reading is masking what's really going on here. This is a child with very, very significant problems with decoding, who probably has great verbal reasoning, probably a very intelligent young person. They're using their verbal reasoning to guess at words when things are in context. And so that's inflating their score. What I'm trying to point out here is that composite scores will often mask what's going on, and you need to be careful in always looking at the scores that make up the aggregate. Go ahead, Sandy.
Any other questions on that or anything? Okay. All right, let's take a look at a case study, and this will probably help you to understand it. So we're taking a look at a little girl, age 9, grade 4, referred by her teacher because she has trouble with reading. She does well in math. She's well liked by her classmates. Very hard worker, but tries to avoid reading. I don't know if any of you have a little child like that in your classroom. And we have a question, always ask for the sub-score. Yes, absolutely. Always ask for those sub-scores. Okay, and we'll see how this plays out again with Amy. And yes, the cluster score is the same as the composite. Those are two names for the same thing. Okay, so let's take a look at Amy's scores here. Okay, so I put these in this particular order for a reason. Word attack, that is on the Woodcock-Johnson, your list of nonsense words. And you're going to look at the order in which these scores come out. This is very significant for a child with a decoding problem. So you notice when she has the word attack, the nonsense words, she has a standard score of 70, a percentile rank of 2. Now the letter word identification is the Woodcock-Johnson list of real words, rank 5. So she's a little better because she has a little more to go on. Now look what happens with the gray oral reading test on the accuracy. The decoding there goes up a little more because it's in a context, and look what happens with the curriculum-based assessment. The words correct is 65%. So what you have here is a pattern that the more decontextualized it is, the more of a problem somebody's having. So always look at these tests and kind of look in this order. If they're having the most problem with their nonsense words, followed by their list of words, followed by a passage in context, followed by material they know, then that is telling you right there you have somebody with a serious decoding. You're looking at somebody with a reading disability. And here's another thing that I find really interesting. This little girl has numerous repeats and self-corrects because she's using the context to guess. You know, when we're taught how to do running records, we're taught that self-corrects are a good thing because that shows that they know meaning is the most important thing of reading, so they're stopping and correcting themselves. Well, yes, in the sense that good for them, they're trying to figure out what it says, but if there's numerous self-corrects, that's telling you they have a decoding problem. So that's something you want to think about, when you're testing somebody. Again, you want to write down exactly what they're glitching on, and this is one of the best things you can do. If you're not a real trained person in teaching reading, have them read and write down the words they get incorrect and look at the pattern. If they're having trouble with words of more than one syllable, you know what you need to work with them on, clapping out syllables. If they're having trouble with vowel combinations, then you're wanting to use the highlighting tape and have them go in and find those vowel combinations and work on one. Or maybe they're dropping the endings out. But all of these things are very symptomatic of decoding problems. The guessing, based on the first letter and the configuration of the word, undertakes, and they're saying understands. It's wishful, and they're saying wisdom. All of those things are giving you a clue that this person has a decoding problem. Now let's look at Amy's comprehension when we assess her. Her gray oral comprehension, she's getting a standard score of 8. She's getting a rank of 25 percentile. Her passage comprehension, she's getting a standard score of 86, a rank of 18, because that passage comprehension in the gray oral is a shorter segment. And look at her curriculum-based assessment. She's getting 90% of that because she's been paying attention in class. Again, that's telling you that there's a basic decoding problem. When you compare those scores to one another, and that's what a good diagnostician will do, compare things to one another and look for trends and patterns. So you clearly have somebody here with good verbal comprehension skills, good verbal reasoning ability. And look at that curriculum-based assessment. That's learned material. She had the benefit of her classroom discussion, so she's looking real good there. And this is where you don't want to have somebody as a teacher, you don't want to make the mistake of saying, well, look at how well she can do, so I guess she's just not trying. No, you have somebody with high intelligence that's kind of masking her serious decoding problem. And as that text becomes less predictable and she doesn't have the background knowledge, that's when she falls down. Let's take a look at her. Yes, go ahead.
This is kind of the case, and you can see where this could be very confusing for a teacher. Because if a teacher, say this child is in the 5th or 6th grade and the teacher has a classroom of students, this little girl probably looks pretty good. She's probably very motivated. She's trying very hard, working hard. And it may not be easy for the teacher to determine that she has a decoding problem. They probably seldom read orally in class. This also may be the kind of child who's having a lot of meltdowns at home over homework.
Yes.
Because she can't do it independently and her parents are having to help her.
Yes, that was exactly my son. Who turned out to be dyslexic. And in school, his grades were fine. He was moving through the work, but something just didn't make sense to me. And that's why I ended up getting my doctorate, was trying to figure my own son out, because something didn't make sense to me. And every evening it was the meltdowns and the biting the pencil and all of that, because it was so hard for him to get through that material. Okay, moving on with Amy, looking at the fluency. She's got a 9%. We would expect that. It's hard to move quickly through reading when you can't decode it. But in her curriculum-based assessment, much better showing because she's familiar with that material. So her fluency issues are directly related to that difficulty with decoding the words accurately and automatically. So I think this case study probably helps you put it together and see the big picture. We're going to go into the next construct, but are there any questions about the case study? Is that making sense to you? Any comments on the case study, questions about the case study? Okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah, as I started to learn about how to put all those things together, it really began to unlock to me what it all looks like. So I was excited to be able to show that to you. Yep, a pretty familiar scenario. That's right. Okay, we're going to move on to the next construct. And I know that we did have someone asking about assessing kindergartners, and this is the big one for kindergartners, is phonological awareness. We have a quote on here from Dr. Torgeson. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Florida Center for Reading Research, but that is just a real cutting edge center for putting out a lot of valuable resources. So write that down on your paper, FCRR, Florida Center for Reading Research. If you're not tapping them, you can go to their website and they will actually give you activities that you can use at your centers. You can print these things out, make yourself notebooks full of all of these things, and they will take these research-based constructs like phonological awareness and give you all kinds of activities that you can use with your children to build them up in this area. But anyway, as we spoke last time, phonological awareness is that sensitivity to or explicit awareness of the phonological structure of the language. And it's that ability to notice, think about, or manipulate the individual sounds of words. And we're going to show you exactly what we mean by that. Just a minute. I want to see if I have a question. No. Okay. All right. So what does it mean? How do we evaluate phonological awareness? Well, the very first thing is rhyming. There have been times when parents of kindergartners have said to me, I'm worried. I don't know how my child really is doing in reading. And my first question is, can they rhyme? That is the most basic look at phonological awareness. And whenever you're doing a task, you have an identification and a production task. So again, if you're taking notes, be sure you write that down, identification and production task. In the hierarchy of tasks, your identification task is always the easiest. So if I say, which of these two rhyme, you're having to identify. And once you can do that, okay, now tell me a word that rhymes with, then you're having to produce it. And I have a little link on here that I made a couple of years ago with my granddaughter to give you a sense. Which two rhyme? Cup and hat or cup and pup? Cup and pup. You got it. Which two rhyme? Sit and fit or sit and log? Sit and fit. You got it. Which two rhyme? Hop and chop? Whoa, or hop and girl? Hop and girl. Hop and girl? Let's try it again. Hop and chop? Hop and chop. Yes. Okay, let's see. Pin and tin or pin and tack? Pin and tack. Pin and tack. Pin and tin. Okay, so that shows you that to give you a little idea with that. All right, so that's your rhyming. Let's see. Next is
rhyming is generally thought to it should be in place by about the age of 3.
Okay. Yeah, and that I think I did that with her when she was 4, and it was a little distracting because we had the other little one jumping on the bed. But anyway, thought I'd give you a little picture of that rhyming. Okay, so for segmentation is that they are able to separate the sounds, not segmenting. Sometimes when you look at it, you might be thinking of syllables or something, but no, can they segment? Can they peel off the individual sounds in a word? So if I say cat, are they able to say cat and hear those separate sounds? That's huge. That's huge. If they're having difficulty in kindergarten, we may have reason to be concerned. Next comes the blending. And again, it's best to do this if you want to be very uniform with a taped instrument such as the Woodcock Johnson, so that those isolated sounds are presented in a very uniform manner. So the tape is going to say f, I, g, and the child is going to have to hear those separate sounds, put them together, and say fig. So all of this, very, very symptomatic for these younger ones. Deletion. Now, these next ones, I want to show you how to do it with a paper that I put together for you. Deletion, substitution, and reversal. Very often, these are assessed with the Lindemood auditory conceptualization test, and we have children representing sounds with blocks. And I put together a little something to show you what we mean by that. So let's say I said to the child, and you would go through a little training with them, so they're learning that each of these blocks are representing a sound, and you're doing kind of a touch and say. So here's an example of how to do deletion, for example. If this is cat, k, a, t, show me at. So then the child would have to know to put this one to the side. or substitution. If this is cat, show me cot. So they would have to hear that the middle sound is changing. Now notice, phonological awareness is not the same as phonics. There's nothing to do with the actual orthography here. This is not about the letters. This is about the sounds, and this is huge if they're not able to hear that. And so we start with the beginning sound because that's the easiest for them to hear. Next, the ending sound, and then the middle sound is the most difficult for them to hear. And then if you're talking about reversal, that would be really hard. That would be really hard. If this is cats, show me cast, and they would have to move those blocks. So that's a test of phonological awareness, and that's also a great way of teaching. If we do any other follow-ups on how to work with children, you can do that with these colored blocks. You can do timing. You can get their speed up. Eventually, they go to letters. If that's cat, make cot, change it to cot, and they're doing it as quickly as they can. Change cot to cots, change cots to ots, etc.
That's actually a very powerful teaching mechanism. I use it a lot when I train teachers. It really helps a lot when we're doing remediation.
Yes, yes. So that's a little bit about your phonological awareness. Let's see, looks like we have a question. Do you think that working memory can become problematic? Yes, yes. Actually, when we do our performance analysis, we're going to look at that. Yes, that can come into play. If there's an issue around working memory, that certainly can. Great question. So Lorna, take a look at this performance analysis, and there you go. Number 3, bing, bing, you got it. You got it. Great, Anne.
So once again, what we want to do is to try and figure out why a child would be having difficulty on tasks of phonological awareness. There's a lot of issues at play here that we want to consider. The first one is sound discrimination. Is the child actually hearing the differences between the sounds? For example, can they hear the difference between a and I, or between g and b? What about sequencing? Do they have trouble with sequencing? Do they even understand the concepts of before and after? And as you've already asked about, memory. In order to sequence something, you have to have good short-term memory. And if children have difficulty with memory, it won't be excluded to areas of reading. You'll be seeing this in other parts of the testing too. Segmentation. Well, of course, segmentation is the primary task of phonological awareness. Can they separate the sounds? Like in cat, do they know that it's made up of 3 separate sounds? Now, segmentation, of course, involves discrimination and memory. So you want to try and sort those issues out. And then manipulation is the ability to delete, substitute, and reverse, as Sandy just showed you. It's the more advanced version of segmentation. If you have a child who seems to be doing just fine on the first 4, but is having trouble with manipulation, that's much easier to deal with because that's a simple issue of training. Okay, Sandy.
Okay. It's funny, I just got a comment. Okay, so now we're getting to one that I'm really excited about, which is rapid naming, and I'll tell you why. When I started learning about this whole thing about rapid naming and what it is, which I'm going to tell you about, I went to a conference in San Francisco, and I learned a little bit about it, and I learned that it was Marianne Wolf that came up with this whole concept that rapid naming was predictive of reading ability. And I found out she was in the Boston area. At the time, I lived in that area, and I went and looked her up, and I actually got to participate with her over the summer in the piloting of what would become the RAND test. So this is very exciting to me. So the RAND test is the ability to rapidly name sets of objects, letters, numbers, and colors. And what Marianne Wolf, a neurologist, came to the conclusion was this, that the same skill it would take you if you were going to name in order a set of colors or pictures, that same skill is the same kind of a skill you do when you're reading. So think about it. When you're reading, you're looking at an abstract symbol, you're having to pull up a name for it, you're having to release that and go on to the next abstract symbol. So she started thinking, I wonder what would happen if we had kids do this with colored blocks, if it would be predictive of their reading ability. And sure enough, it was. Now, what happens on some of these tests, and I want to warn you about this, is that people forget the whole point of the rapid automatic naming and why it's working. And so if you give a child a test and they're having to read letters, for example, on the dibbles, and they don't know their letters, then that has nothing to do with rapid naming skill. They have to already know their letters. I'm going to show you what I mean by this. It really works the best with the colors. So let's take a look at this little picture here. So you see how it's black, red, yellow, green, blue. So if a little child was what I'm going to say, did not have a reading problem, they're going to go through this and they're going to go black, red, yellow, green, blue, red, black, yellow, blue, green. But if it's a child who has this particular type of a problem with rapid naming, they're going to go like this: black, red, yellow, green, blue, red, black, yellow. You see how they're, well, maybe not quite that bad, but anyway, I'm a little dramatic.
That's much worse.
Okay. But you see how they're laboring over it. Isn't it fascinating? It's the same basic type of skill. So if you have a child in kindergarten and you wanted to just do your own little assessment, you could actually make these colored blocks and have them read them and have different children read them and see how they do. And that might be symptomatic of something. And you can buy the rapid automatic naming test, the RAN, as well. But again, just something for you to be aware. There's a connection here. Okay, well, Lorna, do our performance analysis.
Okay, so once again, let's try to think about what could cause a child to have difficulty on the test of rapid automatized naming. Well, clearly, children who have trouble with word retrieval are going to have trouble on the RAN. Children who have trouble with cognitive flexibility, and by that I mean trouble with switching. For example, parts of the RAN include a combination of colors and letters or colors and numbers. So they have to go back and forth. They can't get into a cognitive set and stay there. Some children have a lot of trouble with that sort of flexibility. And then our old friend, processing speed. Kids who have slow information processing are clearly going to have difficulty on the RAN. So understanding which part of the process is problematic for a child, once again, is going to help us to inform instruction. Now the RAN, there is now a standardized version of the RAN, but there's also a non-standardized version of the RAN. There are some tests that I think are very important to use standardized versions. I think that with both the RAN and the test of phonological processing, it's not so important that you have a standardized score. In fact, for tests of phonological processing, the LAC is particularly informative because you can go off the standardized measurement and engage in some teaching to see what it would take to get a child to a different level. So there's definitely some benefit in non-standardized measures for these two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, our next construct, Lorna, verbal memory.
Okay. Verbal memory, again, measures the ability to recall language in context and also in isolation. And it's associated with decoding and reading comprehension. And what we do is we move from simple to complex when we're evaluating verbal memory. And as you've noticed, that's a paradigm that we're using a lot, moving from simple to complex when we evaluate anything. So we start with word lists. There's no context. How far can a child go with just recalling lists of words? And then you go to sentences. There's context, but it's short. And then you go to stories. The test that I favor to evaluate these is the wide range assessment of memory and learning, because it has all three. And it's just so helpful to be able to compare the difference of a child's performance when being asked to recall lists of words as opposed to lists of stories or lists of sentences. That comparison is very informative, and there's usually a profile that emerges. For example, kids who are having difficulty with phonological processing are often the children who have difficulty at the discrete level, and they're having trouble with recalling words. All right, Sandy, let's go on to that next case.
Okay, let's take a look at Tom.
Okay, Tommy is a little boy who's in the first grade. He's 6, and he was referred by his mom because she's concerned that he's not, quote, catching on with reading. His teacher says not to worry. There are other kids in the classroom who are at his level, and besides that, boys often learn much slower than girls when it comes to reading, and he's going to be fine and he'll learn when he's ready. That is a story and a theme that I hear an awful lot from parents, that teachers often advise parents that things will be fine and the kids will learn when they're ready. Let's take a look at what Tom's test results were. I administered the Lindemood Auditory Conceptualization Test. Are any of you familiar with that? I know, Anne, you've asked about the LAC. Is anyone else familiar with the LAC? Well, the Lindemood is similar to what Sandy was mentioning to you before. It entails blocks, and you go through a series of training, so you make sure that the kids understand. Well, Tommy had difficulty with the training piece. He was having trouble with the sequencing. He had trouble with the directions. He could only do the first 2 items, and once again, he had to have support. He had trouble with auditory discrimination, so he wasn't even always hearing the difference between sounds. We couldn't really get a score for him on the Lindemood. So then I gave him the test of auditory analysis skills. And that's a fairly simple test to administer. It only takes about 5 minutes. And it's a simple test of sound deletion. You start with syllables, say cowboy, now say it again without the cow. So you go through a whole series of elimination of sounds. And he was able to segment syllables there, but he couldn't eliminate any beginning, ending, or medial sounds. His performance on the sound blending test on the Woodcock-Johnson is a taped test in which kids hear sounds spoken in isolation, and they're asked to blend them together. He had a lot of trouble with that. His performance was at the 2nd percentile. Now, he did fine on the RAN. He had some mild inefficiencies with word retrieval, but his performance was actually quite good. I wasn't able to get any kind of a measure for him on any standardized test of letter word identification. So I administered an informal test written by Gene Schall, and he was able to identify letter names, but he couldn't identify all the sounds. He missed all the vowels, except he did know short A, and he couldn't read any words in the CVC pattern consistently. CVC pattern refers to consonant, vowel, consonant, for example, words like cat, stat, and so forth. Sandy, can you flip over, please?
Yes, and I've been, I hope my typing isn't distracting here. I've been responding to some messages. It looks like somebody lost sound. I don't know if anyone else has or if it's just the one group seems to have lost their sound.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, I'm not hearing
okay.
it. Okay.
All right, so I'll make ahead with his performance on verbal memory. His verbal memory for words was in the 5th percentile. That's very low. It's consistent with children who have trouble with phonological awareness. They have trouble at that discrete level. His performance for memory for sentences was better, the 25th percentile. Stories was at the 63rd percentile. there's a real pattern here. This little boy really relies on context. So let's kind of review. He had serious trouble with tests of phonological processing. Doesn't know all of his letters and sounds. Can't even read the simplest CVC words. Rapid naming seems to be fine. Mild issues of word retrieval. Significant difficulty for recall of decontextualized words, but he did really well in recall for stories. He needs help. He needs context to help with verbal memory. Go ahead, Sandy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, that's him. That's him. Any other comments on him? Questions?
Our conclusion for Tommy is that, he's in the first grade. And is he reading where he should be reading for a child in the middle of the first grade year? Absolutely not. He's having trouble with the basic issues of phonological processing. That should have been mastered by the time he left kindergarten. He doesn't know the sounds of all of his letters. That should have been mastered by the time he left kindergarten. He should be well into the whole process of starting to put this whole thing together and reading. And he's not even close to being there. This is a little boy who we can't ignore. We can't wait for him to fail and to get further and further behind, because that in and of itself will bring all kinds of behavioral and emotional issues. Are there any questions about Tommy?
Okay.
Okay.
All right, we're going to move on. That's too bad. Our one group that lost sound is just having to watch the screen. Let me just type them a quick message. We'll send you the recording. This is going to go to all, but anyway. Okay, we are on to our next construct, which is spelling. Spelling is such a big area because spelling is not just spelling. When you're looking at a child with a reading disability, spelling tells a lot. Of course, spelling is encoding, which is the reverse of decoding, and it can provide insight into the nature of reading problems, which we're going to take a look at. The way you assess spelling is with a standardized dictated spelling list, or you evaluate it in an unedited writing sample. I can't say enough about having to have children write in the classroom, because as you look at children as they are doing their writing, and don't try to go in there and continually correct their spelling as they're writing, for two reasons. One, you want to see how their sequencing sounds, and two, this is just an aside, but the brain has the two parts, right? The editor part and the creative part. If the brain is in a creative flow and you keep trying to get the editing part to show up, then you're just going to squash the creative part. So you want to just let them write, and then you want to go in there and analyze their spelling errors, and that is going to give you so much insight into reading problems. It's just amazing. And quite often, if I go into a classroom, a teacher will say, well, I'm worried about so-and-so's reading. And I'll say, well, let me see their writing. And they don't have anything to show me. They'll have things that the child copied, and that's a sad day. Just taking a look at this writing sample right here, you see an orthographic problem for somebody in the fourth grade looking at a word like writing. We talked about orthography before. Those are children who have trouble holding a picture of a word in their head. These are the kids that if you write something on the board, you see their heads popping up and down, trying to copy it from the board. Basically, if you have a child, this is just a little bit of an aside, but if you have a child with an orthographic problem, you don't want to give them things that they have to copy from the board, for example, for science or social studies, because it's not a fair playing field. They're going to copy it incorrectly, and then they're going to get, or math, they're going to get it incorrect, and it's more of a copying issue. So you want to give their materials to them right there at their desk, already written out. You don't want them to have to be doing copying from the board. But at any rate, that's orthography. And if you look at spelling, you're going to be able to see, are there problems with orthography, with their sight words? Are there sequencing sound problems? All of this shows up in their spelling. And by the way, if you are a teacher of a child with dyslexia, with a reading disability, you want them to have spelling lists that match the sequence that you're teaching them in reading, because reading and writing are opposite processes of the same thing. So if you're working on short A, that's what their spelling list should have. So
That's also a very important strategy for help when we're providing remediation for kids. If kids are being pulled out for reading, I think it's very helpful to individualize their spelling list for classrooms so that the person who's working with them on reading provides the classroom teacher with words that are consistent with where you are in your decoding.
yes, yes. So it all fits together. So spelling, that's an exciting thing to me too, because you can just get so much by looking at a child's writing. So you look at it. It provides insight into their phonological processing. Remember, we talked last time about dropping off whole syllables? Well, if the word is banana and they're writing bana, that tells you that there could be a phonological processing problem if you see a lot of that. It provides insight into the application and understanding of phonetic rules. If the word is supper and they're writing super, then they don't understand their closed syllable type. So then you're needing to work with them on syllable types. It provides insight and understanding and application of morphology. Like we said last time, if they're writing jumped, sixth grader writing jumped, then they're having difficulty with understanding root words and suffixes, which has to do with your morphology. So you can get a lot from the spelling. And if you can get a lot from spelling, what about written expression? That takes it even to the next level. And this is our 8th construct here. So you want to evaluate their unedited written expression in their short and extended conditions. And that actually gives you insight into their oral expressive abilities and their reading comprehension. It's pretty amazing when you look at what they're putting down, then you can almost hear their voice. And you want to look at the difference in performance of writing under those short conditions and extended conditions. And interestingly enough, as you begin remediating written expression, you are helping a child's reading comprehension. Think about it. As these students are learning to write and organize the text of this increasing length and linguistic complexity, they're going to understand those kinds of sentences. Because if I'm working with a child and I'm saying, okay, let's look at a complex sentence. As I think about it, comma, I begin to realize, and I talk to them about those dependent and independent clauses and why it matters to put the dependent clause first or last and how that changes the implication of what I'm saying. When I'm working with them in their writing, then as they read, you can say, hey, look there's that same kind of a sentence, and it begins to help their comprehension as well. So written expression is a big one. I have a lot of stuff on writing. I have workshops I do on that. I have student writing samples that really are helpful in understanding all of this. So when you're analyzing the written expression, what does that tell you? That tells you their vocabulary, their word usage. You know, we created some prompts and sent them out to students in our schools here in Florida. And when we analyzed their samples, it was really interesting. There was one boy, and his writing passage as a 7th grader, his grammar was fine, but it was just so simple. The vocabulary, you know, our prompt was, what would you do if you had a day to spend with a friend? And this poor kid had to write hypothetically. He was saying, well, if I did have a friend, here's what I would do. And we began to realize his vocabulary was very, very basic. Grammar, you're looking at their grammar. That's what we're good at as teachers. We know how to correct grammar. That's basically what we do too much sometimes. You're looking at their sentence construction. This same boy, 7th grade, all simple sentences throughout. That's telling you something. Paragraph construction. Are they able to write a topic sentence with main ideas? Organization of the whole thing. Is it something where you could cut up the paragraphs, put them in a paper bag, shake the bag, empty it out, and it doesn't matter what order you put it in? That's telling you something. Okay, and we're getting to the end here. We're actually pacing ourselves through. This is amazing. We'll be a little bit over, but I want you to take a look at this writing sample and tell me, what do you see in this very first line here? Um, okay, we do have a question, which I'll come back to in a minute. But what do you see in this first line here? Austin Mahoney life was hected at first at the begging. Austin was born in San Antonio, Texas. What kind of problems do you see in that very first line that should tell you that if this is a sixth or seventh grader, they have a problem that's indicative to a reading disability right in the first line? What do you see there? Come on, you guys. You're not all falling asleep on me. Mechanics, okay, mechanics, yeah. Drill down, drill down. Grammar and spelling, drill down. Give me a word. Give me a word that's indicative of a phonological problem. Okay, hected for hectic. Great, great. Missing sounds in begging. You've got it. You've got it. When you see that hected, that's telling you that they're not clearly hearing those phonemes. And begging, they're dropping off a whole syllable. That right there should be indicative. Thank you. Great job. We have a question here about a good curriculum-based assessment for writing. For me, I just take the actual passage and I start highlighting. I highlight hected. I highlight begging. I go through the whole thing and I look for patterns. It's amazing what you can find. So that's, yeah, suffixes, dropping off of suffixes. Yes, yes. But how do you measure progress is the question. On an IEP, how do you measure progress? Well, you could, there are some assessments that you actually count the number of errors. I'm trying to think, Lorna, do you know the one, there is a method that you can use where you count the number of errors in the writing sample. And then the next time they write, you again count the number of errors and you get the percentage.
I use two methods of measuring progress on an IEP for written expression. I use the test of written language, and I use the written expression from the Woodcock-Johnson.
So that's
now, I have to say, neither one of them are wonderful. But frankly, there is nothing wonderful out there. And it's really hard to get a good measure of written expression.
How do you get them to the right so that the samples are comparative? These are all great questions. You could use a similar prompt. Sometimes,
if you use the test of written language, there are two prompts. So you really do have a fairly decent comparison, and it does give you standardized scores.
Okay, good. Very good, very good. Okay, we are just about to the end here, but last time there was a question about monitoring progress, so we put a couple of slides in for you, and then we'll be to our wrap-up. So go ahead, Lorna.
Okay. Well, this kind of fits in a little bit with how you measure progress for an IEP. And I think that this is where I recommend using some standardized tests, because it's very easy to get a good comparison by comparing standard scores and percentile ranks. So what you do is you get a baseline when you are first writing an IEP, so that you've got a baseline of standard scores. You re-administer the same test at the end of the year. Now, for standardized tests, you usually have to have 12 months time gap. So most standardized tests have two versions, a version A and a version B, so that at the beginning of the year you administer one version, at the end of the year you administer the other version. And go ahead and give us the next slide, Sandy. And what you do is you compare percentile ranks and standard scores from one administration to the other. Now, on this particular test, they were administered a year apart. One was April 24th, 2015, and then April 29th, 2016. Letter word identification, you can see that the child in 2015 got a standard score of 70, percentile rank of 2. A year later, a standard score of 85, percentile rank of 16. That's a very, very nice improvement. That's not easy to do. Passage comprehension started out in 2015 at 115, percentile rank of 84, dropped slightly to 113 percentile rank of 81. Sentence fluency started out at 85 percentile rank of 16, dropped slightly to 82 percentile rank of 15. You would need to do a little bit more testing to find out what's exactly going on here. But just looking at these scores, my hunch would be that this is a child who got some very good remediation. And because that's not an easy gap to start to fill in on. And they've been working very hard on decoding. Perhaps a little bit less attention to comprehension, and certainly a little bit less attention to fluency. However, those scores are not significant, are not statistically significant in their drop. And so this may not have much meaning, but you can certainly check that out with any other tests to make sure that that's indeed the case.
Okay.
Are there any?
Go ahead. Questions on that? Questions on that? Okay, well, we've made it through our 8 constructs and told you a little bit about testing. That was a lot of info today. I hope we've kept your attention through all of this. Quarterly progress monitoring. We do have a question about quarterly progress monitoring.
Quarterly progress monitoring is generally done in most schools informally, and they're using various forms of informal progress monitoring. I have to tell you that I meet regularly with a group of colleagues in Boston where we all do evaluations. We're all neuropsychologists, and we evaluate children. And it can sometimes be very frustrating because the reports that we get from school about progress monitoring almost never are consistent with the reports that people from the outside, independent evaluators, get. We're not quite sure what's going on with the progress monitoring done in schools. Maybe it's the tests are being used. Maybe it's the way they're being monitored. I really don't know.
Yeah, and it could be maybe people don't, well, maybe people have ulterior motives. I guess I'll leave it at that. But it's a problem. Yeah. All right. Well, we're about 7 minutes over here, but we will wrap up. We've got our email addresses here. We've got our Smart Kid Can't Read website. Lorna has a blog on there. I will be getting my website back up. I found out it had crashed, so I want to put that together and get some resources, and I will be letting you know on that. And we do want to.
So we also should let folks know that if any of you are interested in having Sandy or I take a look at any reports for you and give you any feedback, you can do that, and you can get that to us through the website. Also, if any of you have used these screening tests and would like to videotape the child that you're testing and get feedback from us, you can also do that.
Yeah. And we're going to try to put together some other things that we think will be helpful to you. We'll try to do some follow-up things. So that's it for now. And any other questions or anything, let us know. And otherwise, we'll be signing out.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah, I hate to say goodbye. I feel like I'm getting to know all these people. They're growing on me, Lorna. This was a wonderful group with the questions and everything. Okay, we're getting a lot of a nice response here. Great audience. Okay, thank you so much. And okay, the informal test. Oh, you did not receive the video. You should have gotten a link. Okay, if you did not receive the video last week, then something happened. You can email one of us. You see our emails down there, and we will get you that link. And I'm going to send you this one as well. And if you did not receive the informal screening packet for some reason, email us about that. And oh, okay. Yeah, there may be some confusion over email addresses or whatever. So yes, we will definitely send you info as we come up with future classes and get all this ready. So, and anything, if you didn't get the tests or you didn't get the,
The link for the test, actually, it was a PDF that went out for the test, and that went out in the same email that you got the link for the first webinar.
yeah, but if there's anything you don't have, not a problem. Um,
Just
oh,
let us know.
okay, okay. We may have, it may be because if people paid with a different email address or something. All right, I'm going to write all of this down with people's email addresses. Just a second here, and then I'm going to sign off. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. If we have somebody else's email address in our mailing, let us know if we need to change that. And you can always go and register again. Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. J Miller DFCS.
So that's
Yeah, we have a registration link that we were hoping people would register to. Okay. All right. I think I got that. And I'm going to sign off now. And if you need anything, you have our email addresses. So have a great night. And we're glad you tuned in. Bye bye now.
good night.